Hello, AP US History students, and welcome back to another session of US History. Today we're going to talk about Lesson 5. We're going to talk about early in the Civil War. We're going to talk about some of the early battles. Now, obviously, there are lots and lots of battles in the Civil War, but we're not going to talk about all of them. We're going to talk about a handful of key battles, just like we did in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 and the French and Indian War. We'll only discuss a handful of the battles. We could probably just talk about the Civil War and the battles for an entire semester and the different strategies of them. But we're going to just kind of focus on some main battles that are key to the war. So that's what we're going to take a look at. We're going to also talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. We'll also talk about today some of the things that were happening out west with the Native Americans during the Civil War that kind of pulled some of our troops and resources out to Minnesota and to Colorado also. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and dig into lesson 5. So when we think of the Southern generals, there were many of them, but the kind of key Southern generals here were Robert E. Lee, who is probably one of the most successful Confederate generals. He ran the Army of North Virginia. He will be the one that will surrender at Appomattox Courthouse to Grant to essentially end the Civil War. We have Albert Johnston, who actually dies in the Battle of Shiloh to Grant. And then we have Stonewall Jackson, who we talked about a little bit in the first Battle of Bull Run. But later on, not in this lesson, but a later lesson, we'll talk about how he dies at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And Stonewall Jackson's kind of like Lee's right hand man that really kind of completes him in having success for the Confederacy. And like I said, the Confederacy is very successful early on in the war. In 61, 62, they're successful until about July of 63, when we start to see the South start to fall apart. Lack of resources, lack of the extended length of the war, when we'll start to see the South losing battles in 63. The Northern generals, we see Robert McClellan will be one such leader. We'll see he is going to be the leader of the Union troops to begin the war. But by the end of the war, it'll be Ulysses S. Grant, who is a West Point grad who won at the Battle of Vicksburg and Shiloh, and eventually will be the man who's in charge of the Northern military at the end of the war. And then we have General Sherman, Tecumseh Sherman, who is probably most noted for his the Sherman's March to the Sea, where he's going to use psychological warfare and essentially destroy everything in his path on the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Oh, excuse me. Wow, that came out of nowhere. Excuse me. So, um, um, that will be Sherman. Okay. So the Northern's plan in this battle. Ooh, I have another sneeze. Bless you. Thank you. You're welcome. Okay. So the goal the of the Union was to put in the Anaconda Plan, and the Anaconda Plan is Winford Scott's plan. And this idea of the Anaconda Plan was sort of like it's a constricting snake. So we can see from that picture that we want to blockade the southern coastline from the ports, from things getting in and out of the south. We also want to control the Mississippi River, figuring we could divide the South, kind of not quite truly in half, but divide the South if we can control the Mississippi River. And that's the goal. Okay, that's the goal. And we also, one of the early campaigns in 62 is the Peninsular Campaign. campaign, which is about trying to capture Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of the Confederacy. This will be led by General George McClellan. And there was a few delays in the training and getting the troops ready, but eventually they do march on to towards Richmond, and this will eventually lead to what they call the 7 Days Battle, which will result in a Confederacy win. Lee was able to drive McClellan back. And once again, McClellan is not a very aggressive general, and that's kind of going to be one of his downfalls when it comes to this war. Now, he will eventually be replaced, then brought back and replaced again. This loss for the North at the Peninsular Campaign will eventually lead to the Second Battle of Bull Run, which again the Confederacy will have another victory. Now, the U.S., like I said here, the U.S. naval blockades of the southern ports was not very successful early on in the war, but it will get more successful after we see the development of ironclad ships that we will see later on in the Civil War. So, once again, early on, we see more victories for the Confederacy than we do for the Union. Now you can see here the two yellow stars represent the two capitals, and you can see they're relatively close. Here we see we'll see in 62 the Monitor versus the Merrimack, which is the ironclad ships that will be in the near the Jamestown River here, just south of Yorktown. Um, and we will see Yorktown. It should sound familiar to you. That's where the British surrendered in the Revolutionary War. But we could see that the battle near Richmond will then eventually lead to the Second Bull Run. It will eventually lead to the battles of Antietam, then the battles of Fredericksburg. So we see a lot of movement once again up by the capitals. Once again, the North is trying to take Richmond, and the South is trying to take DC. Whoever is able to take each other's capital will essentially win the war. That's kind of the goal. Now, so there's a lot of things going on here, and this is in Northern Virginia, Maryland area. Now, in Northern Virginia, or even across the border, just across the border, is the Battle of Antietam, right along the Antietam Creek there. We will see this is one of the bloodiest days of fighting ever to this point in history. We're going to see 5,000 men will die in a day, 22 casualties killed, captured, and injured combined. This, though, when we look at this Battle of Antietam that happens in September 17th, 1862, this McClellan got a hold of Lee's battle plans for Antietam. One of Lee's second in command had dropped them, and we picked them up. And so we had the battle plans. And surprisingly, even though we just had his battle plans, we were only able to come to a draw. That's how good Lee was. When this came to a draw, they kind of some will argue that this is a big momentous victory, kind of like a victory, because essentially Lee went back south. He didn't advance any further north. So this is kind of the first time that Lee is actually stopped and doesn't continue to advance northward. So that's sort of a moral victory for the Union. All right. So Lee is pushed back south. Lee left the battlefield first. Um, and this is the first battle, though, that took place in northern soil. But Lee left the battlefield first. So, in many of the Union's eyes, that this is a big deal that Lee left first. The Confederates left first. So it's kind of a moral victory. This was on September 17th, 1862. With this victory, Lincoln changes the war from beating the Union to slavery. So what's going to happen is this battle this battle will lead to Lincoln writing the Emancipation Proclamation. September 22nd, 1862, he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation will go into place on January 1st, 1863. Okay. This kind of moral victory for the North also discouraged France and Britain from recognizing the Confederacy as a nation. So, once again, a lot going on here. A very bloody battle. We stopped them. Um, Lincoln was a little upset that McClellan didn't chase down um, Lee as he left the battlefield, thinking that he had a case of the slows, that he wasn't very aggressive. And like we said, that was kind of the disadvantages of the northern military leaders. Many of them were not very aggressive. Okay, so once again, this battle will lead to the writing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Uh, the next battle that this will lead to is the Battle of Fredericksburg. This happens um, um, on December of '62. This is a very lopsided victory for the South. Um, this is a huge Southern victory. We're going to see that the Union will have over 12,000 wounded or dead to the South's 5,000, like a 2-to-1 kill ratio. Okay. Um, so this Battle of Fredericksburg will eventually lead to Gettysburg. Now, General Burnside will replace McClellan because he's not very aggressive. And what helps the South win here, and let's see if I can do a good job drawing it here, which I'm not the greatest of artists, but let's try to draw it here. Uh, so there's kind of like a slope here to like a sunken road. And the Confederacy, I'll just put a C here, the Confederacy is kind of hidden by this sunken road, and the Union is down here coming upward, and the Confederacy can actually hide behind this kind of this barrier here of this sunken road and shoot south, or it's not southward, downward. So they had essentially the Confederacy had the high ground. So therefore, by having that high ground, they were able to win rather easily in this battle with that sunken road right there. So that once again, um, the Union won't forget this because it'll kind of be a role reversal at the Battle of Gettysburg. The Union will have kind of the high ground to the Confederacy, and that's where you'll see the Union win at the Battle of Gettysburg. But this is the Battle of Fredericksburg, I'm sorry. This is in December of '62. Okay, and this is in northern Virginia. Once again, near Richmond, near Washington D.C. So here is the bridge at Antietam, Burnside's bridge at Antietam here. Okay, here is that sunken road right here, where the Confederates were able to shoot down, and to the left here was a slope. So this is kind of that retaining wall that was there to make it kind of a defilade um, for the Confederate soldiers. So once again, if we take a look here, we see Fredericksburg right here in the middle of your page here. We see Antietam is up here in Maryland in the top here in the green. So you can see that McClellan brings the troops there in Antietam. He'll be replaced by Burnside. Burnside goes to Fredericksburg, loses at Fredericksburg. Um, and we will eventually lead towards um, Gettysburg over here. Gettysburg will be in Pennsylvania. But once again, there are a lot of fighting around the two capitals, uh, D.C. and Richmond. Now, as we're fighting over here in the Let's see if I got my writing. Ooh, there it is. We're fighting up here near the two capitals. We do see fighting along the rivers. We see the fighting along the rivers here, right? We're going to be along the Ohio River here, okay, down the river here, into the Mississippi River here. And eventually it'll lead to a major battle at the Battle of Vicksburg. So those are kind of the areas that we see the fight. Here, it points out the Fort Sumner that was lost in 61. We will see Sherman's march to the sea that will go through Georgia to here and then through Carolina and back to the north. And then you can see that we're trying to set up that blockade around the South to keep them from having trade with foreign nations. So once again, we see the majority of the war happening in southern states in the Confederacy. Now, as you can see, a lot of the battle that does happen in the South, and as the Union went south, they would confiscate Confederate property, which include slaves. The enslaved labor was considered contraband. And this will lead to the Confiscation Act of 1861. So it is not uncommon as the Union marches southward that slaves would run away from their plantation to Union camps because then they would be essentially considered contraband and essentially now have their freedoms with the Union. Now, once the Emancipation Proclamation is passed, we will see some of those former enslaved labor will now join the Union Army and will fight in the Union to end the Civil War to defeat the Confederacy. Now, we will see this war is seen through a lens, a camera. We will see cameras are new technology, and we will see for pictures of the war. We'll see big open fields of soldiers that are laying dead or wounded. And the question becomes when you look at a picture, is that my brother? Is that my father? Is that my son? Is that my uncle or my nephew? So it really gives people perspective of the deadliness of this battle. With new technology, we're seeing more and more people killed at each and every battle. Um, Back in the Revolutionary War times, the French and Indian War times, we were looking at paintings or drawings. Now we're actually seeing actual pictures of the fallen. So it really gives a different perspective of the deadliness of the Civil War. We also see a lot of new technology with the development of the steam engine. We saw that with the Lowell mills, but we see that with steamboats and trains, and we're able to move things now. We're able to move soldiers and materials for our soldiers, especially in the North, because the North had more railroads. We see the development of the telegraph and new technology of cannons and guns. Guns are more accurate, they shoot farther now. We'll see the development of ironclad ships. We will see the development of roadside hospitals. The first, Clara Barton will start what they call the Red Cross that still exists today. And then obviously photography. So we see new inventions that are being used during and new ideas being used during the war. Now, in the South, we're going to see the Battle of Vicksburg. The Battle of Vicksburg. Now, the Battle of Vicksburg is vitally important. Here it is, right here. Let me right there. The Battle of Vicksburg. And to kind of give you an idea, the Mississippi River kind of has a bend. Well, that's not a very good bend, but has a bend in Vicksburg. And this bend has on one side a 200-foot kind of cliff or plateau, and the other side of the river has kind of a swampy land. So if you were trying to go up, north up the Mississippi River or south, if you go through this kind of bend, the Confederacy controlled Vicksburg, And by controlling Vicksburg, they control the flow of ships up and down the Mississippi River. So um, Grant, who had won some battles up in Kentucky and Illinois and Tennessee, are starting to move southward. Um, really, in Shiloh is where he wins and moves southwards towards Vicksburg. Now, as we move southward towards Vicksburg, this is a 7 week battle. Okay. And a lot of people will say that this victory is on July 4th, 1863. So we win at Vicksburg under Grant in 63, and the Union takes control of the Mississippi now, the Mississippi River. And on July 3rd, the day before, up in Gettysburg, and if you look, let me get my pen out. Where is it here? Up here in Gettysburg, up there in the day before, the combination of these two victories, the victory at Gettysburg on July 3rd and the victory at Vicksburg on July 4th, is kind of the turning point of the Civil War. So once again, Grant is moved south. He took Shiloh, Tennessee, continued south and took Memphis, and eventually took, after 7 weeks, Vicksburg. Now it's called the Gibraltar of the Mississippi because if you know where the Straits of Gibraltar are, between Africa and Europe, when you go from the Atlantic Ocean into the Mediterranean, there's that little tiny narrow passageway between Morocco and Spain. That's called the Straits of Gibraltar. So it's kind of like you can control what goes in and out of the Mediterranean Sea there. Same basic idea here. Whoever controls the Gibraltar of the Mississippi, Vicksburg, controls the Mississippi River. And he will do that. Grant will win at Vicksburg. And eventually, this happens in 63, in July of 63. By early spring of 64, Lincoln makes Grant the head honcho of the entire Union Army, of the entire Union military. Okay. So the war is happening in a lot of places. It's happening up near the capitals, along the Mississippi, but we also see conflict happening out west and in the northwestern regions. So here is Grant's passage. He started in Cairo here, Illinois, moved um, into Kentucky, into Tennessee, into Memphis, and then down into Vicksburg. At the same time, the Union's taking control of the mouth of the Mississippi and New Orleans, and moving up the river, up the Mississippi River. So we're accomplishing our plans to control the Mississippi River, and that's what the Union wants. They want to control the Mississippi River. So, like I said, we see a lot of things happening. We see March 9th, 1862. We see the first ever ironclad ship conflict. This is over there by Yorktown. We will see we tried to cut off commerce between the Confederacy and the rest of the world, and we weren't being very successful. But by 63, our Navy got better because of ironclad ships, and our blockades began to work. Now, yeah, on March 9th of 62, we will see both the Merrimack and the Monitor will fight to a 5 hour duel that will end in a draw. But this is the first time we see two ironclad ships fighting against one another. This is a turning point in our naval warfare. From here on out, we're going to be building ironclad ships, and we will see the American Navy transform after the Civil War to iron ships. And that's really kind of setting a precedent and will make us a very powerful nation in the world because of our ironclad ships. Now, as I said before, we do see conflict happening in other areas outside of the typical Civil War areas that we had mentioned along the Mississippi and up near Richmond and D.C. We see conflict erupting up in Minnesota area. We will see that there's going to be the Santee Sioux Uprising, or it's also called the Dakota War of 62 or Little Crow's War. The Dakotas up there were called the Eastern Sioux. Now, this happens in August of 62. Some Northerners, settlers in there, felt that this was kind of a Confederate. The Confederates were helping the native uprising up here. Um, so there's a lot of skepticism. Now, because we're focused on the Civil War, we owed, because we took land from the natives, we promised them in treaties, we promised them certain provisions within the treaties, whether it's giving them money, giving them food. We were promising certain things within our treaties. And because our focus was on the Civil War, we weren't fulfilling the promises that we made. So the indigenous people, the natives, came to the towns there and were like, "Hey, where you owe us." And our military was like, "Let them eat grass and or their own dung. Like we're not going to give them these things. We don't have these provisions for them." So this will lead to an uprising of violence. We will see huge amount of violence between the soldiers, and we'll have to send more soldiers there, and the Native Americans. We're trying to protect the settlers that are up there because remember we passed the Homestead Act, and we're trying to send people out that way. So we will see that over 300 natives were arrested and sentenced to death. Now Lincoln will commute more than 200 of those sentenced to death, but we will see that 38 Native Americans were hung in December of 62. It's the largest mass execution by our federal government at one time. But once again, this we see this rising conflict as we're sending more and more people with the Homestead Act out westward. Okay, we'll see the finding of gold and different minerals out west, and we'll see more and more people moving westward. We will also see out in Colorado and eastern Colorado, we'll see the Sand Creek Massacre. Now, back in 51, we agreed to the Fort Laramie Treaty, which guaranteed the natives land, uh, like their own land that we wouldn't mess with. But with the growth of, we saw the gold rush and we saw settlers moving out west because of the Homestead Act, because of the finding of gold out that way. We see even Europeans that came and people from Asia came to the West. We see a lot of civilians there trying to take the land from the natives. So the natives go to the local fort and says, "Hey, we need to be protected." So the fort, they tell them to go to Sand Creek. You'll be safe there. So they go there and they're planning on being safe. So all the men go off to hunt and get food for the tribe. While the men were gone, while the male natives are gone, the governor of Colorado will essentially get these uh, Colorado volunteers to get rid of the Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians, the natives there, and they will come in and they will slaughter and mutilate mostly women and children at this famous Sand Creek massacre. Now, once again, early on, people in there were grateful for this, but then our federal government was like, "No, this is bad. You crossed the Fort Laramie Treaty. You this," and so it was originally, championed at first by those that lived there, but our federal government will talk about how bad it was. Now, this will create more rising tensions between the natives and the settlers, and we will see more and more conflict between the natives and settlers as we go throughout after during the Civil War, after the Civil War, up until close to the turn of the century. We will see continued conflict with the Native Americans and settlers as we continue on with our manifest destiny. So this is happening during the Civil War. These conflicts out west with Native Americans. So America, the Union is fighting the Confederacy in the South and fighting to protect settlers out west and in the Northwest at the same time. Now, eventually, like we said before, the Emancipation Proclamation will be signed or put in place after the Battle of Antietam. Lincoln announced that we are moving from just preserving the Union to ending slavery. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation was announced that unless rebellious states return to the Union, he's going to declare their slaves free forever. So the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect January 1st, 1863, um, and it's slaves are free in rebellious states, not those border states, those 4 or 5 border states. Those slaves are going to still be there. Why? Well, it's a pretty moderate approach because we don't want those border states to leave the Union. So we're going to only outlaw slavery in the Confederacy. Only in the, now, do you think the Confederacy instantly go, oh, Lincoln ended slavery, so we have to let them all go? No, not really, because their president is Jefferson Davis. He's the president of the Confederacy. So those southern states aren't going to listen to Lincoln. But what it does do, the Emancipation Proclamation, it gave the North a high moral reason for continuing the war. Gave them a moral reason to fight the war because he's ending slavery. Okay, so it ends slavery in rebellious states. So those are the Confederate states. It gave a high moral reason for continuing the war. It led to the creation of of people of color joining the Union Army. Okay, and it was also put in place to hopefully end enslaved labor in Confederate areas, so that the enslaved labor isn't working on things to help the Confederate soldiers. Okay, now eventually, with urging of abolitionists, we will eventually put in place the 13th Amendment, which will be ratified in 65, which will abolish slavery. Which will abolish slavery. So, once again, the Emancipation Proclamation, ending slavery in rebellious states, raising the morale of Northerners to continue fighting the war. It opened the door to have people of color join the uh, military to help the Union win, and to hopefully end the assistance of slavery in providing food and weapons for the Confederate soldiers. So, like we said before, African Americans were now able to serve in the Union Army. They still faced discrimination within the Army. Um, they were not paid equally. Um, Eventually, that will be equalized by 64. We saw segregation within the armies. There were all black units and all white units. So people of color were in one unit, and white people were in another unit. Um, Probably one of the famous movies that shows this is Glory. It talks about the most famous people of color regiment was the 54th Massachusetts, who was gained fame during the attack of Fort Wagner in South Carolina in July 18th, 1863. All right. So we see a lot of things changing. If you have an opportunity to see Glory, if it's on Netflix or Amazon, it's a good movie. There are some bad words, there is violence in it, but it is a good movie. Denzel Washington is in it, Morgan Freeman's in it, Matthew Broderick. If you're familiar with Matthew Broderick, he's the guy from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. It's a great movie. Anything Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman are in tends to always be good. They're always in good movies. I can't think of a bad Morgan Freeman movie or a bad Denzel Washington movie. Okay. Um, so by now, we should be able to put some things in order. If we think of chronological order, if we look at Um, these five things, if we were put them in chronological order, so if you pause the video and put these in chronological order. All right. So if we go back here and we take a look, um, what was the first thing? Well, the first thing would be right here, the South Carolina leaving the Union. That would be the first thing. Remember the Deep South, they left in December of 60. Okay. What was the second thing? Well, the second thing would be the succession of Alabama. Remember those other six southern, deep southern states left before the fall of Fort Sumter. So there were seven states that left before the fall of Fort Sumter. So that would be second. The third thing would be Lincoln being sworn in as president, his inauguration. The fourth thing would then be once Lincoln is president, the surrender of Fort Sumter, and then Virginia was one of those states that didn't leave the Union until after the fall of Fort Sumter. It's one of those four states that left after the fall of Fort Sumter. Hopefully, you did well on that. So by now, you should be able to explain the advantages and disadvantages that the Union and the Confederacy had in the Civil War, explain the reasons behind the Emancipation Proclamation and why it was only implemented in rebellious states. And then you should be able to tell us about the significance of the Battle of Vicksburg. Okay? So until next time, have a great day.